Should voter participation be mandatory in the United States? Voter turnout in presidential elections tends to hover below 60%, while in midterm elections it drops to the low 40s. This pales in comparison to other democracies such as Australia, where over 90% of eligible voters cast ballots in elections. In many countries, including Australia, voting is compulsory, and eligible voters who do not participate in elections are subject to a penalty, such as a small fine or denial of certain public services. The fines themselves tend to be less than $20, and enforcement is inconsistent, but the effects of these laws are striking. In general, countries that make voting compulsory average around 85% voter turnout. The case for universal civic duty voting is simple. By requiring participation in elections, government will have more legitimacy and be more representative of the populace. In some U.S. national elections, the results are decided by less than a quarter of eligible voters. This poses a challenge for the legitimacy of liberal democracy. A survey by the Knight Foundation found that only 38% of unregistered non-voters expressed confidence that the election results represent the will of the people. These challenges are the subject of a recent report titled "Lift Every Voice: The Urgency of Universal Civic Duty Voting," which makes the case that mandatory participation in elections, along with policies that increase access to the ballot box, would ameliorate this crisis of legitimacy for American government. The report was written by the Universal Voting Working Group, made up of 25 scholars, experts, and former elected officials who collaborated over the course of 18 months to develop the case for universal civic duty voting in the U.S. The authors of the report compare it to other civic obligations that citizens are required to perform.
We do this now with jury duty, and people are accustomed to that. And so we think that the same reasoning applies to voting as well, which is that you want the fullest representation of everyone in order to have the best kind of decision-making.
Key to the working group's proposal are complementary measures that would make voting easier and more accessible. After all, if government makes participation mandatory, it also has to accommodate voters by lowering barriers that discourage them from heading to the polling place.
You can't superimpose a requirement if there are hurdles that are placed in the way of people voting. So there's a whole suite of policies, from same-day registration to automatic voter registration to pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, which should be implemented. And we think that having the idea of universal civic duty voting as a North Star will make it more likely that those complementary policies will be put into place.
The report acknowledges some problems that may arise from civic duty voting. These include concerns that enforcement could be applied disparately towards marginalized groups. There is also the question of whether such a policy would stand up to a constitutional challenge.
One of the likely criticisms will be that somehow this is compelled speech. But what we're doing is proposing that you don't have to vote for any particular candidate. We would have none of the above as an option in every ballot. We would have the ability for people to say they have a conscientious objection to voting. It's compelled participation, but we do that in juries, in paying taxes, in sending our kids to school.
So is universal civic duty voting the way forward for American democracy? It may seem like a radical approach, but as the Universal Voting Working Group points out in their report, this policy has been implemented in some form in over 24 democracies around the world, and many features of American democracy, such as the right to vote for women and people of color, seemed radical until they were adopted. Now they are the norm. Perhaps universal civic duty voting is an idea whose time has come. The Universal Voting Working Group was convened by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School and the Brookings Institution. It was co-chaired by Miles Rappaport and E.J. Dionne Jr. You can read the report by visiting ken.sc/universal voting.